This is the IBJ Podcast for the week of July 22nd, 2019. I'm Mason King.
Iceberg, right ahead!
Thank you.
Iceberg, right ahead! On the starboard!
Well, we don't know exactly how things went down on the real Titanic when it sank in 1912. But this clip from the 1997 movie makes it sound like sighting the iceberg triggered chaos on board. The boat, of course, has become synonymous with organizational failure, and it provides a pretty tidy metaphor for companies that sink. What's interesting is that while a lot of imperiled companies are perfectly aware of their vulnerabilities and the icebergs ahead, many don't see them coming at all. 3 people with deep roots in the Indianapolis startup scene have written a book called The Titanic Effect, which builds on this metaphor of an ambitious enterprise launching into a sea of hidden or barely visible problems, many of them of their own making. Extending the metaphor, they refer to these so-called hidden debts, and they're not necessarily talking about financial debts, as icebergs or debtbergs. In essence, the Titanic Effect explains why startup failure is nearly always the result of a series of errors that weren't obvious. The authors are the husband and wife team of Todd and Kim Saxton, who are business professors at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, as well as Indianapolis-based serial entrepreneur Michael Cloran, whom you might best know as a founding partner of DeveloperTown. The book was released a month ago, so I caught up with the Saxtons to discuss the finished product and what it has to say to entrepreneurs who are approaching a sea of uncertainty. Here's our conversation. Kim and Todd, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Before we get started, I wanted to quickly set the context for when we talk about startups. Like, for example, do we know how many companies are started in a year in the United States, typically?
If we looked at all the companies in the United States that are under 100 employees that have a Dun & Bradstreet listing, it's about 5 million.
Oh, a ton. Okay.
That's not started per year, though. That's the total number in that size range.
Right.
Okay. What is the survival rate, or maybe you have a better word for it? I mean, how long do these companies typically stick around?
Yeah, so the data also suggests that about 50% of them go out of business in the first 4 years.
And then and when you get up to 10 years, it's 70% plus. Yeah. What I think the data are missing, and I think gets maybe better to your initial question, are the number of startups that actually never even get off the ground. So what do you actually call the birth of a startup? Is it when it incorporates, when it has its first sale? There are a number of kind of events or metrics you could use, but there are many, many would-be entrepreneurs out there who have great ideas that never even get to either of those steps. So how do you count those, right? And that's, I think, one of the challenges in kind of measuring and productivity as well as just kind of output and survival rates.
So we in the business press, when we talk about startups and entrepreneurs, we're usually talking about people with some kind of ambition, for growth. Usually we're talking about sectors like technology and healthcare and life sciences and sports and consumer products.
Yes, and we differentiate lifestyle businesses versus startups. So scalable startups. So the ideas you're talking about are people who want to start a company and grow it, maybe take on some funding, maybe be disruptive. We tend to call those guys startups. There's other people who have a lifestyle business, meaning they want to employ themselves in something that's meaningful to them, maybe employ 1 or 2 others, maybe their family. Those are really important too. Family businesses are hugely important, but they're probably not going to take on money. They probably don't have scalable sales. They're not going to be something that we read about.
So it's such a provocative title. But what I really like about it is that it's also really evocative for a lot of reasons. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but to me, it immediately suggested that at least one of the most common problems with running a startup is hubris.
Certainly, the kind of know-it-all entrepreneur needs to recognize that there are some icebergs out there that they can run into. And there was certainly some hubris on the part of both how the Titanic was built versus how it was designed, for example. The captain, who had an unblemished record over 40 years and never had an accident, it is hinted at, perhaps didn't pay quite the attention he should to the iceberg warnings in the area. So I think you're correct in drawing, but the analogies run much deeper than even that.
I will jump into one real quick. One of the things that I thought was fascinating that you brought up was that the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. But the reason why it was vulnerable was due to a long series of decisions that were made ahead of time. Translate that to business. How does that translate to startups?
We discovered a lot of that after the fact. So in the naming of the book and the first time we did the presentation, we had this idea of what we call these hidden debts. So technical debt is one of them, but there are these other hidden debts that are beneath the surface. And the provocative title and cover of the book shows that translation to an iceberg where 90% of the mass is below the water. And most people, when they think about icebergs and casualties, do jump to the Titanic at some point. So that became the basis of the title, The Titanic Effect. It wasn't until afterward when we, and largely Kim, started actually digging into the history of the Titanic and the White Star Line that we realized just how far that metaphor could go in terms of extending to these decisions that came even decades earlier that relate to hidden debts.
So, and the idea that we stress in the book, and that's really important to remember, is that in order to grow, and particularly for startups, their future is uncertain. They don't know what the right choice is. There are many, many choices, and each one of those choices has trade-offs. So you have to take on these hidden debts in order to grow. You have to make the decisions. You have to move forward. The big idea that we try to stress in the Titanic Effect, it's not that you shouldn't ever make those choices or have those debts. It's that you need to be aware of them, because the problem happens, the Titanic Effect, what we call it, is when those choices interact. So, and these affect all businesses. For example, the Titanic was an engineering marvel. They had new engines that generated propulsion in a different way than ever before. They had a new watertight compartments in order to keep it afloat that they had never had before. And they were so worried about it that they brought a lot of engineers. And so they only had 8% of the crew were true seamen, which is great if you have an engineering problem. But what happens when you have a sea problem? And they had a sea problem. So it's that the choices interact with each other. And that's the same thing that happens in business. You make one choice that seems like it's a good choice at the time. And then a year later, there's a different choice that now goes back and interacts with that first choice.
When we talk about hidden debts, what does that really mean?
So these are basically the intangibles, and the whole process of starting a company is about navigating uncertainty, and that's across several domains: the product or the technology you're using, the people you're engaging with, your co-founders, your advisors, investors, etc., the market that you're trying to sell to, and all of these elements kind of interact that kind of can lead to these challenges. The idea of hidden debt is that these intangibles, the results of making these decisions under uncertainty, create these either obligations or limitations for the startup in the future.
Would, for example, the seamen, the engineers versus seamen, is that an example of human debt?
Yes.
Okay.
Having the wrong kind of employees at the wrong time. That's a startup problem.
Yeah.
And the classic version that we see with startups, it comes from two different places. Either because you are on a shoestring, what you do is you get a bunch of recent graduates or interns to do all the work. They're like $30,000 a year, but who's running the work? Great enthusiasm, a lot of creativity, probably some really innovative ideas there, but they don't have the experience to know what works and what doesn't work. Or we see the opposite extreme, which is really over-investing in what often is called a whale. So somebody who has a lot of experience, deep talents, comes with a record of success somewhere else, and you bring them in to work their magic here. Well, if you don't have the other pieces of the pie right, and then somebody's trying to work their magic, it's not very magical.
There are three other kinds of debt. What is marketing debt?
So marketing debt is the same kind of idea, but on marketing related issues. And the 3 C's that we have in the marketing ocean are segmentation, positioning, and then tactics. And the number one reason that startups fail is no market need for the product. So marketing actually ends up being sort of the biggest debt. There's lots of really cool ideas. Is this a really cool idea that solves a problem that's worth paying for? So we call that the customer value void, which is that you've got something really cool, but either people can't pay what it costs to make it, or they don't want to pay for it at all.
So the number one reason why a startup would go out of business is they're making something that people don't actually want.
Exactly.
How does that happen?
Some of that is about finding the right target market. So that's why one of the C's is segmentation. You can't a startup can't go after everybody. It has to pick one group of people for whom it's going to be perfect.
I'll answer that question a little bit differently, which is, why does that happen? It happens because the entrepreneur goes and asks some friends, some family members, and they go, "Nice idea. That sounds awesome." Even they wouldn't pay for it, but there's a lot of kind of patting on the back and celebration of the idea without any real kind of validation process systematically to find out, will customers actually pay money for this thing, which is very different than, do people like my idea?
Now, I'm not a business guy. I read about business. I'm not a business guy. But even I know you should go out and talk to people about your idea. Do they not do that, or do they just not do it the right way?
Well, I think not doing it the right way is a really important piece of things, and it's not unusual when an entrepreneur has an idea that they go present their solution to the customer without really having a deep understanding of the problem itself. And this is where kind of design thinking and empathy come into play. Many of the really smart entrepreneurs we know aren't always the most empathetic or best listeners in terms of getting feedback. So sometimes you have to have someone else help you engage in that process. But presenting a solution to a customer is very different than going in and asking questions about the problem itself. And that's one of the icebergs in the technical sea that we talk about, is kind of jumping to the solution before you've actually gotten a deep understanding of the problem and the job that you're trying to accomplish for that customer.
The other thing I think it's important to recognize is that founders are told, you have to be persistent with your ideas. And so when you see a roadblock, they're like, well, I'm just going to persist over this one. And it's hard to hear that, no, really what the feedback is that this is a bad idea.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break to survey the horizon. You're listening to the IBJ Podcast.
The IBJ Podcast is sponsored by Krieg DeVault, a trusted and dynamic law firm representing a wide variety of local, regional, and national clients. Committed to each other and to every client, Krieg DeVault prides itself on integrity, professionalism, respect, and excellence. Financial institutions, global manufacturers, national healthcare providers, and successful organizations of all sizes and market focus rely on Krieg DeVault to create innovative and successful business solutions. Connect today at www.kriegdevault.com.
All right, we're back with the IBJ Podcast, and we're talking with Todd and Kim Saxton about the Titanic Effect and the problems that sink startups. What is a strategic iceberg, or strategic hidden debt, as you would say?
Well, yeah. So that's the key about strategy, is bringing all the pieces of the puzzle together. And so what we often see happen, that product market fit is really critical that we talked about. And that means having a product that's evolving, having a market that's evolving, and having them fit together. There are two other icebergs in the strategy ocean. Well, meager measurement, which, we have all this data. But what we often see is people get so busy doing, they don't look at the data that they have, and they don't even have metrics about what success looks like. So just reminding them that, if you don't know what path you're marching towards, then how are you going to judge success? And the last one is accountability. Somebody has to be accountable for different things. Often it's difficult in a startup for people to decide who has which lane. We're all in the same pool. We don't all need to be in the same lane. And holding people accountable for the lane that they're in charge of.
Okay, so I am starting a business. I'm the captain of whatever my boat is. How do I avoid all of these icebergs?
Read the book.
Read them. there it is.
The thing is that,
is it okay to make some of these mistakes?
Oh, for sure. And they're all recoverable. So most people that read the book who are in startups right now, we get the most sort of sadly hilarious emails. Just got off the plane, have a list of 8 things to do starting tomorrow. I had to stop reading because the Uber was finally here. These are the 2 things I'm starting on next.
Well, that's fascinating. So from all these emails you get, what are the most common bits of feedback that you've gotten from the book so far?
Well, initially when we were presenting and in the process of writing the book, it was, where were you 2 or 3 years ago?
For sure.
That was kind of a recurring refrain. Now there are some questions about, how do I actually kind of track these things systematically? And part of what we've tried to do is to develop some tools kind of around the book that make it easier for entrepreneurs and their supporters to kind of implement. So we've talked a lot about the entrepreneur, him or herself, but there's a whole network of supporters of entrepreneurs that can help them be successful, help them identify these icebergs and navigate around them.
So there's kind of a hubris, or a point of hubris, I would imagine, is thinking, I'm a smart guy. I've got an education from such and such. I don't need people to tell me what to look out for.
And as investors, we would call that kind of the uncoachable entrepreneur. And we're not interested in even helping, let alone investing in entrepreneurs that kind of seem to signal that. A good test that we use is if in their pitch they have a founding team, maybe even early employees, and they're still referring to the venture as they really haven't internalized the team concept.
Oh, that's fascinating. How often does that happen?
10 to 20%?
Yeah, but more often than you would think.
So that's interesting. So different kinds of entrepreneurs will make different kinds of mistakes.
At different stages. So you also have to remember that startups start and they go through evolution. So we kind of break it down in the book as 4 stages. So there's pre-revenue. So you just have ideas and you're trying to sort them out. And sometimes mistakes made here kind of really hamper you in the long run. Thinking about who your founding partners are and sorting out which market you want to be in early on is really important. And then the next stage is MVP, so you have a minimally viable product. Probably not any customers yet, maybe some beta trialers, something like that. There's a different set of mistakes you tend to make then. And then now you've got your first customers and you're smoothing the product out. It's not perfect yet, but you can replicate it. You kind of know where you're going. That's another set of problems. And then the last one is scalable. And this book is aimed at early stage ventures. By the time you're taking on, $20 million and you're scaling, you're probably out of the water for what we've covered. So this would be a great book for someone who wants to start a business to kind of get the lay of the land before they start making some of those mistakes.
What is the most obvious problem that entrepreneurs still fail to address? Like, they see the iceberg. They know that iceberg is there, and they still think they can plow through it somehow.
I'll share one from the human ocean that continues to perplex entrepreneurs, even serial seasoned entrepreneurs that we talk to, and that's how to allocate equity early. The tendency is you get 2 or 3 people sitting around the table drinking a beer or having coffee, and you sketch something out on the back of the napkin and you go, hey, the 3 of us are co-owners at 33 1/3%. You've allocated all the equity. You've barely begun the journey. You have no idea who's going to actually drive the ship and do the heavy lifting, and you've already allocated 100% of the equity, which is crazy. So that's probably the most consistent, but also one of those really difficult entrepreneurial conversations to have is when you have allocated equity and you have to kind of go back and say, look, this isn't really working out. Or even when you kind of have to raise that, especially with an inexperienced entrepreneur, saying, hey, we all have the best intentions and want to make this successful, but we're 2% of the way through the journey. Let's not allocate 100% of the equity yet.
Yeah, that's been one of the most fascinating bits about my education, just writing about companies, and especially these companies that grow fast and then suddenly there's an exit, is where did all the ownership go? It sounds like, when somebody starts a company, well, Bob and John own 50% of the company each. And then somewhere along the line, it gets diluted and diluted and diluted and diluted. And that sounds like just a painful experience that have to constantly go through, well, how much more of the ownership of the company are we going to give away? So there's a way to sort of address that.
Yeah,
but don't give it all away at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you've cut up the pie and put it on everybody's plates before you actually have even baked it or decided what kind of pie you're going to make.
Yeah.
And mentally, it's really interesting to see the difference in how founders think about equity if they've each taken 10% and say, okay, so there's 80% left. We can earn some of that. We bring in other people to earn that, as opposed to, hey, we each have to give up 10% in order to bring in this chief marketing officer who's really going to make this company work. The idea of giving something up is so much harder than allocating from a pool that you've set aside that no one kind of technically owns.
Is there any other kind of really obvious sort of thing?
Well, I would say the big one, and this was a big part of the motivation for even taking the step of writing the book and sharing this, is that you're probably familiar, I'm sure, with kind of the lean startup and the idea that you kind of pivot when you run into any kind of obstacle. And every time you pivot, you are creating these hidden debts. So while we are big believers in the general principle of thinking agilely and kind of the lean startup mentality of getting out in the market, experimenting, and redirecting if you need to, do just be cognizant of the fact that every time you pivot, you are encountering or generating these hidden debts.
What is a hidden debt that you would get from like a major change in direction?
Yeah, so let's back it up for a second. The process of getting product market fit takes 4 years. So you're going to make a lot of alternative choices. And what some people do is they sort of rush into the marketplace without having that thoughtful validation, getting some good feedback. And what you want to have are hypotheses. I think it's A or B and possibly C. And what ends up happening is they rush out, they do something, and then they say, oh, that's not it. Let's change direction. And they change direction. And then they say, oh, that's not working. 2 months later, and they change direction again. Well, you've already projected to the marketplace what you're all about, and people already have some ideas. Some people raise their hands and they thought that's what you were offering, and now when you've changed the product and everything else 2 months later, they're not going to raise their hands. They raise their hands for something different. And so for one, you can't really scale your investments in marketing. You're essentially, throwing people away as you make those changes. Secondly, it takes time for people to catch up. So even your own organization, if you say we're a Bluetooth headset company, and then 2 months later you're a Bluetooth speaker company, think of all the places that you have Bluetooth headset. Think of your own employees' minds, and like, oh wait, now we're something else. And I'm actually talking about Jawbone, which was a Bluetooth headset company turned Bluetooth speaker turned fitness tracker that liquidated after $400 million invested. Gone.
Let me get meta for a second. So when you guys were putting together this book and writing this book, did you run into any icebergs?
Pretty much all of them.
Seriously?
Absolutely. Yeah. So
I mean, knowing them doesn't mean you don't hit them. It just means you recognize what to do after.
Okay. Give me two. What up?
Well, talk about founder debt, right? And we have 3 very capable, interesting people who have very strong ideas, right? So getting some consistency in kind of the voice of how we translated our story to a book was a challenge, and getting all of us on the same page, and then actually committing to kind of putting pen to paper. We probably should have incorporated some experienced authors and or editors earlier in the process. And it wasn't that we thought, oh, we're smart, we can do all of this. It just, we weren't even aware of those debtbergs before we started writing. And then the other question is that product market fit, and we have a lot of people who ask us, so who is this book ideal for? And we think we have an appropriate answer, which is it's ideally for, as Kim talked about, that early stage entrepreneur, pre-revenue or very early in scaling, and their supporters. So then you have investors, advisors, people in the community, like the folks at Techstars, for example, or Launch Indiana, who are working with startups even if they're not starting a company themselves. We also think there's something for the general reader who just likes business and history. So all of a sudden we've gone from a pretty narrow focused target to everybody's going to love this book, and we certainly hope everybody does, but that's such a classic entrepreneurial mistake for us to fall into. So I cannot say we are without debtbergs.
I'll give you one last one I think is kind of funny. So we've known Michael Cloran for a long time, and he's heard me talk about marketing issues quite a few times. And one of the things I talk about is frame of reference. What's the category you play in, and then what makes you different? What's your point of differentiation? And it wasn't until we did our first podcast that he says, well, you have to understand, in our frame of reference, startups and startup books, we're the only book that tells you what not to do. I was like, that's brilliant. We should have written that first. And it was the tech guy who did the marketing thing.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, guys. I appreciate all your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
My thanks again to Kim and Todd Saxton. And before you get on with your week, I wanted to draw your attention to a story in this week's IBJ that expands on the topic of startup failure. And it includes personal stories from local entrepreneurs, including Max Yoder of Lessonly and Jeff Reedy of Scale Computing. And also in this week's paper, Lindsay Erdody examines the track record of Elevate Ventures, which acts as the venture capital arm of the Indiana Economic Development Corp. and has invested $91 million in 313 companies. The returns so far have been modest, but Elevate isn't necessarily all about the bottom line. And then, completely off topic, Anthony Shutley profiles Jason Hammer and Nigel Liskowski, also known as the hosts of The Hammer and Nigel Show on WIBC. The station's risk in 2016 of installing two rock and roll DJs as hosts of a news talk show appeared to have paid off. Now, you can read all about it in a copy of IBJ you have delivered to your home or office, or at IBJ.com. And remember, for full and unfettered access to all of IBJ's award-winning business content, just hit the subscribe button. Thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbender. I'm Mason King, and we'll be back again next week.